Episode 1: The Quiet. The first thing people noticed was the silence. It wasn't a complete absence of sound. Not at first. It was a gradual dampening, as if a thick, invisible blanket was settling over the far corner of Harlow, Maine. The morning chorus of chickadees and finches in the hemlock grove turned tinny, then faded. The wind in the tall, proud pines lost its whistle and became a slow, sightless exhalation. Fishermen on the shore of Lake Apathy reported that their lines sank into water that felt heavy, like liquid glass, and the lap of waves against their boats became a dull, listless thud. Sam Lennox, a man who had come to Harlow to be swallowed by quiet, almost didn't notice. His quiet was internal, a roaring absence left by a car crash on a rainy Portland road 18 months prior that took his wife, Elise, and his ability to write a single readable sentence. He lived in her grandfather's old A-frame cabin on the edge of the woods, a place meant for happy summer vacations they'd never taken. Now it was a tomb for a ghost and a man who felt like one. He learned about the phenomenon, which no one had yet named, from Marla at the general store. Her voice was usually a rapid-fire, cheerful barrage. That day it was subdued. "Old Man Turner's dog," she said, ringing up Sam's meager supplies. Coffee, bourbon, frozen dinners. A golden retriever, happiest damn thing you ever saw. Went chasing a squirrel out past the old quarry yesterday afternoon. Came back. Different. Sam grunted, not really listening, his eyes on a dusty jar of local honey Elise would have bought. Just stood at the edge of Turner's yard. Marla continued, wiping the counter with unnecessary force. Wouldn't come when called. Didn't wag. Turner said its eyes. They looked flat, like old paint. He walked out to get it and he says it felt strange out there. Thick, he said, like wading through syrup. He grabbed the dog's collar, dragged it back to the house. An hour later, the dog just lay down. By morning, it was dead. Not a mark on it. Turner said its coat had lost its shine. Went a sort of dull, grayish color before it passed. Sam took his bag. Probably ate something poisoned. Marla shook her head, a strange fear in her eyes. It's not just the dog, Sam. Jenny Carson was hiking the fire trails out there. Came back silent, wouldn't speak to her kids. Just sits and stares at the wall. Her husband says her hair, it's lost its color at the roots. Not white, gray. A dead gray. That got Sam's attention. A prickle, faint but present, traced his spine. It was the first feeling besides numbness he'd felt in months. The next day he met Dr. Eris Thorne. She was parked at the end of his dirt road, a rental SUV loaded with gear that looked both high-tech and rugged. She was in her late 30s, with a sharp, intelligent face and eyes that missed nothing. She was studying a tablet, frowning at a topographical map speckled with anomalous readings. "You lost?" Sam asked, his voice rusty from disuse. She looked up, assessing him quickly. "I hope not. Dr. Eris Thorne, USGS. You live out here, Mr. Lennox?" "Some. Yeah, that's my place." He nodded toward the A-frame. "Have you noticed anything unusual? Acoustic damping, visual fading, behavioral changes in wildlife?" Her clinical tone was at odds with the unease in her gaze. Sam thought of the dog of Jenny Carson. People are talking. Why? Thorne hesitated, then decided on a sliver of truth. "We're detecting a field, a localized area of physical anomaly about 2 miles northeast of here. It's expanding, very slowly but measurably. It affects sound waves, light refraction. I need to get closer, take ground samples. Your road is the last passable access point." Sam looked past her, into the dense wall of pine and spruce. The forest looked normal, but he listened. He realized he couldn't hear the distant hum of the highway he sometimes could on clear days. The air was preternaturally still. "It's not safe," he heard himself say. "That's why I'm here," she replied. Against every instinct that screamed for him to go back to his cabin and his bourbon, Sam said, "I'll show you the trailhead. It's easy to miss." They walked in silence for 10 minutes. The forest path grew quieter with every step. Not just the absence of animals, but a swallowing of their own footfalls. The rich greens of the moss and ferns began to look desaturated, as if viewed through a dusty lens. Thorn stopped, her instruments chirping frantically before their screens dimmed and died. "Incredible," she whispered, not with wonder, but with dread. She bent to scoop soil into a vial. It was a fine, gray powder, devoid of the rich, loamy character of the forest floor. Sam looked ahead. A patch of fireweed, usually a vibrant splash of magenta, stood faded, its flowers holding the color of old newspaper. A squirrel lay on the path. It wasn't dead, not quite. Its sides moved with agonizing slowness. Its once bright eyes were matte, gray marbles. It showed no fear, no awareness of them. A profound, soul-deep apathy washed over Sam. What did it matter? The squirrel, this scientist, Elise, him, all just waiting to turn gray and still. The grief he carried, a constant, sharp stone in his gut, seemed to blur, to soften into a hollow, endless exhaustion. He wanted to sit down right there on the gray path and just stop. "Lennox!" Thorne's voice was sharp, a pinprick in the muffled world. She was looking at him, her own face pale, her breath coming fast as if fighting a weight on her chest. "We need to leave. Now." "Your eyes." "What about my eyes?" His own voice sounded distant. "They're losing color. Come on." She grabbed his arm, her grip surprisingly strong, and pulled him back the way they came. The further they retreated, the more the world seeped back into focus. Sound returned first, a shocking cacophony of leaves and distant birds. Color followed, vibrant and almost painful. The crushing apathy lifted, replaced by a surge of visceral animal terror. Back at their vehicles, gasping, they looked at each other. The roots of Eris Thorne's dark hair were tinged with a streak of absolute, ashen gray. Sam saw his own reflection in her SUV window. The bright blue of his irises, the one feature Elise had always loved, was ringed with a thin, gray haze. "It's not just physical," Eris said, her scientific detachment shattered. "It's psychological. It feeds on passive effect, on resignation." Sam stared at his gray-tinged reflection, at the streak in her hair. The numbness was gone, burned away by fear. The quiet of his cabin was no longer an escape. It was a prelude. The quiet had found him, and it was hungry. Episode 2, The Bleaching. News in a town like Harlow was a virus. It mutated with every telling. The story of Old Man Turner's dog and Jenny Carson's shock became, by the time it reached the diner and the town hall, a tale of a chemical spill or a government experiment. The patch of strange woods was dubbed the Bleach by locals, for the way it seemed to drain the life from everything. Sam and Eris became reluctant partners in a secret investigation. They knew it was no spill. Eris set up a makeshift lab in Sam's cabin, her gear running on a grumbling generator. Data from her surviving sensors painted a terrifying picture. The graying, as they now called it, was a near-perfect semicircle, expanding outward from a central point deep in the forest at a rate of roughly 10 feet per day. This boundary was a gradient of decay. The physical anomalies, damp sound, faded light, were just symptoms. The core phenomenon was a leaching of energetic potential, a theft of vibrancy at a quantum level. "It's like localized, accelerated entropy," Eris explained, pacing the cramped cabin. but directed, selective, and it's interactive. Our emotional state acts as a conductor. The more we succumb to despair, apathy, grief, the faster it affects us. Sam winced at the word grief. He was a walking buffet for this thing. Interactive means intelligent. I don't have a better word for it, she admitted. A force with a preference. They needed to find the source. Eris believed it was geological, perhaps tied to a unique mineral formation reacting with groundwater. Sam, whose mind was trained by a lifetime of crafting narratives, felt it was something else. A wound, a scar. Their research was interrupted by the first human death. It was Billy Corrigan, a gentle, slow-witted man in his 50s who lived with his mother and collected interesting bottles he found in the woods. He'd wandered into the graying, likely following a deer trail, searching for treasures. He was found 2 days later, sitting upright against a gray birch tree, perfectly preserved but utterly lifeless. His skin was the color of cold ashes, his flannel shirt a uniform pale gray. His open eyes were like clouded quartz. In his lap was a collection of bottles, now all the same dull, translucent gray. The medical examiner in the next county called it catatonic failure of all systems, a term he invented on the spot. The official report whispered of a bizarre, fast-acting fungal infection. The town's mood curdled. Fear was a more potent fuel than curiosity. Sheriff Ed Morgan, a pragmatic man with a deep love for Harlow, imposed a loose quarantine on the northeastern sector. Roadblocks went up. Rumors of a CDC arrival swirled. Eris knew they were running out of time. We have to go deeper, to the epicenter. My readings suggested depression may be a sinkhole or a cave system at the origin point. I need to see it. Sam refused. The thought of venturing further into that muffled hell, of feeling that apathy claw its way into his soul again, was paralyzing. Their argument was cut short by a visitor. It was Mrs. Corrigan, Billy's mother. Her face was etched with a grief so profound it seemed to bend the light around her. She didn't cry. She held out a small, gray object to Sam. "Billy had this in his pocket," she said, her voice a dry leaf rustle. "Wasn't gray like the rest of him. Not quite. It was a pocket notebook, the kind he used to sketch bottle shapes. The cover was faded, but not uniformly. In the center, where it had been pressed against his body, a faint, dirty color remained. Sam opened it with trembling fingers. The pages were mostly blank. But on the first page, in Billy's clumsy, childlike script, written in pencil that had not fully succumbed to the bleaching, were 2 words. "It remembers." A chill, deeper than any the graying had produced, locked Sam's joints. He looked from the note to Mrs. Corrigan's hollow eyes, to Eris's stunned face. "We go," Sam heard himself say, the words leaving his mouth before his mind could veto them. "Tomorrow at first light." That night Sam dreamed, not of Elise as she was vibrant, laughing, her auburn hair catching the sun, but of her in the moments after the crash. A still, gray figure in a hospital bed, the life monitor showing not a flat line, but a slow, slow fade to a permanent, muted signal. In the dream, the gray walls of the room began to pulse, to breathe, and a voice that was not a voice, more a pressing of intention into his mind, whispered, "Come. It is quieter here. No more pain." He woke in a sweat, the crushing weight of his loss fresh and new. He stumbled to the bathroom, flicked on the light. The gray ring around his irises had thickened, and now, at his temple, a single streak of hair shone silver white against the brown. The graying wasn't just around him. It was in him, marking him, calling him. Episode 3, The Heart of the Stillness. They prepared like astronauts entering a void. Eris packed geological tools, hardened cameras, and biometric monitors. Sam brought practical things. Climbing rope, a compass, though Eris doubted it would work, a hunting knife that felt foolishly inadequate, and Billy Corrigan's notebook, which he kept in an interior pocket. They dressed in bright orange, a futile protest against the fading. At the last moment, Sam slipped a small, framed photo of Elise into his chest pocket, over his heart. They crossed the official boundary, marked now by faded yellow police tape that itself was leaching of color. The world dropped away. The symphony of the forest was replaced by a vinyl record playing at the wrong, sluggish speed. The air grew thick, resistant. Each breath felt incomplete, as if the oxygen itself was lethargic. They moved in silence, communicating with gestures. The further they went, the more the landscape resembled a charcoal sketch. Trees stood as smooth, columnar ghosts. Fallen leaves were crisp, gray shards that powdered underfoot. They found more animals in that terrible state of living death. A fox curled in a gray ball, its breath a plume of fine dust. A hawk perched on a branch, its magnificent feathers now indistinct, like stone carvings. Eris's instruments failed one by one. Her tablet screen grayed and froze. Their watches stopped. Time became subjective, stretching and compressing in the thick air. Sam felt the pull, the seductive whisper of surrender. Every memory of Elise that surfaced was instantly drained of its warmth, leaving only the sterile, aching outline of loss. It would be so easy to just sit down, to let the grayness take the pain away. He fought it by focusing on Eris. Her determined stride, the stubborn set of her jaw. She was fighting her own demons. He could see it in the tension around her eyes, in the way her fingers would sometimes brush the new, broad streak of white in her hair. She was here for answers, for order, for a problem she could solve. He was here because a dead man's note had asked a question he now needed answered. What remembers? After what felt like hours, the forest floor began to slope downward into a shallow basin. At its center was not a cave or a sinkhole, but a grove of ancient, massive hemlocks, or what was left of them. They stood in a perfect ring, their bark smooth and pale as bone, their needled branches holding not green, but a million shades of gray, like a photograph from another century. In the center of the ring was a clearing, and in the clearing was a stone. It was a glacial erratic, a house-sized boulder deposited millennia ago. But it was wrong. Its surface wasn't rough and granite gray. It was smooth, almost polished to a dull sheen, the color of a long-dead star. And it was pulsing, not with light, but with a subtle, rhythmic dimming, as if it were drawing the very concept of brightness from the world around it. This was the heart, the source of the graying. Awe and terror held them frozen at the edge of the stone circle. The air was so thick it was a physical pressure on their eardrums. Sam's grief felt like a solid thing in his chest, a cold, gray stone matching the one before them. "My God!" Eris breathed. The sound swallowed instantly. "It's not natural, not just a mineral. This is an event." Sam took a step forward, then another, drawn not by curiosity, but by a profound, weary longing. The stone promised an end to the struggle, the ultimate quiet. Yes, the word formed in his mind, not as a sound, but as a deep, resonant lack, a cessation of noise. Come, rest. He was within 10 feet of the stone when Eris's hand clamped on his shoulder, spinning him around. Her face was a mask of terror, her lips moving. He couldn't hear her, but he could read the words, "Your eyes, Sam, your eyes." He blinked, and in the gray twilight of the clearing, he saw tears on her cheeks. But they weren't clear. They were tiny droplets of silvery mercury, tracing gray lines down her skin. He looked past her at the great stone, and in its pulsating, light-sucking surface, he didn't see a reflection of the dead grove. For a fleeting second he saw images. Not clear pictures, but impressions, emotions frozen in gray relief. The terror of a hunted animal. The crushing grief of a mother who'd lost a child. The quiet despair of a man watching his farm fail. The bewildered sadness of Billy Corrigan, lost in the woods. A century of quiet sorrows, small and large, absorbed by this place, by this stone. All the pain that the vibrant, noisy world had inflicted, collected here. This wasn't a geological anomaly. It was a sump, a drain for human and animal suffering. And his own grief for Elise was swirling toward it, a fresh, potent stream feeding the ancient, hungry stillness. The realization broke the stone's hold. He grabbed Eris's arm and mouthed one word, "Run!" They turned and fled, stumbling back through the monochrome hell, the pressure in their heads building to a silent scream. They didn't stop until they burst through the tree line, past the police tape, collapsing onto the vibrant, loud, technicolor moss, gasping great, painful, beautiful breaths of full, ingrédients d'air. They lay there for a long time. Finally, Eris whispered, "It's a psychic capacitor. It feeds on passive, negative emotional energy. Grief, despair, apathy. It's not just affected by it. It's attracted to it. It cultivates it." Sam sat up, clutching the photo in his pocket. He thought of Billy's note. "It remembers." "It doesn't just remember," Sam said, his voice raw. "It collects. It saves up all the sadness of this place. And we've been feeding it. The town, my grief. It's making it stronger. It's why it's growing." He looked toward the woods, now deceptively normal-looking. The quiet was no longer just an absence. It was a presence. A patient, insatiable presence with a taste for human sorrow. And it had just had its first full-course meal in Sam Lennox. It knew his flavor now. It would want more. Episode 4, The Weeping. The world outside the graying continued to turn, but Harlow was sick. The official story held a strange fungal outbreak, contained. But containment was a lie they told themselves. People knew. They felt it in the unnatural stillness of the northeast wind, saw it in the ashen streaks appearing in more and more hair. Not just Eris's and Sam's, but in the sheriff's beard, in the hair of Jenny Carson's children who visited her catatonic form in the clinic. The town's grief over Billy Corrigan, its fear of the unknown, its underlying economic despair. It all became a fog that hung over the streets, palpable and heavy, and the graying fed on it. Eris's measurements, taken from a distance with newly hardened equipment, confirmed their worst fear. The expansion rate was no longer linear. It was accelerating. 10 feet a day had become 15. It was learning, growing stronger on their collective dread. Sam became a haunted man. The gray rings in his eyes were permanent now, giving him a distant, ghostly look. The streak in his hair had widened, but the dream calls from the stone had stopped. Instead, he was plagued by echoes. Passing the playground, he'd feel a ghostly pang of a child's forgotten disappointment. In the grocery store, the weary resentment of the cashier would wash over him like a cold tide. He was becoming a tuning fork for the town's subdued sorrows, all of which seemed to vibrate toward the gray heart in the woods. Eris, ever the scientist, theorized he was sensitized. "You have a high emotional valence, Sam. Your grief is pure, unresolved. It's made you a conduit. The stone is broadcasting, and you're receiving." "It's not broadcasting," Sam corrected her quietly. They were in his cabin, maps and sensor readouts spread everywhere. "It's draining, and I'm standing in the current." They had to act. Eris proposed a physical intervention. Drilling, sonic disruption, targeted electromagnetic pulses. An attempt to short-circuit the psychic capacitor. Felt like throwing pebbles at a tidal wave to Sam. His writer's mind, finally stirring from its long dormancy, worked on a different hypothesis. We're fighting the symptom, he said. The bleaching, the quiet, that's just how it feeds. The thing itself, it's the memory of pain. We have to address the source, the pain itself. How do you address a century of accumulated sorrow, Sam? Do we give the town group therapy? While a supernatural blight eats it from the edges. Before they could clash further, the graying presented a new, horrifying symptom, the weeping. It started at the boundary. Trees just inside the fading zone began to exude a thick, silvery fluid from their bark. It wasn't sap. It was viscous, cold, and smelled of ozone and old tears. It pooled on the gray ground, reflecting the dull sky in mercurial puddles. Animals caught in the advanced zones didn't just slow. They liquefied. A deer was found, half dissolved into a pool of this same metallic substance, its remains indistinct and blending into the gray earth. Worse, it began to affect the catatonic victims. Jenny Carson, in her clinic bed, developed silvery tracks from the corners of her eyes, staining her pillow. The doctors were baffled. It was Eris, sampling the residue with trembling hands, who made the connection. It's concentrated, she whispered, staring at her spectrometer. The emotional resonance. It's off the charts. This isn't just byproduct. It's essence. The pure, distilled matter of sadness. The stone is saturating. It's overflowing. The graying was no longer just absorbing. It was secreting. It was crying tears of solidified sorrow. Panic, held at bay by denial, finally broke in Harlow. A town meeting descended into chaos. Some demanded immediate evacuation. Others, led by a fire and brimstone preacher, declared it a judgment, a cleansing. Sheriff Morgan, his beard now more salt than pepper, pleaded for calm, but his eyes held the same stark fear as everyone else's. In the midst of the shouting, a figure stood up. Old Elsie Murch, the town's unofficial archivist, a woman so ancient she seemed made of parchment and twine. Her voice, thin but clear, cut through the noise. "It's the Sorrow Stone," she said. A hush fell. Sam and Eris exchanged a look. "My grandmother told me stories her Chippewa grandmother told her," Elsie continued, her milky eyes staring into the middle distance, "of a spirit of stillness that lived in the deep woods. Not evil, just empty. It was born from a great, forgotten sadness. A whole people lost to sickness, a wound on the land. The spirit fed on little sadnesses, kept them to itself. For a long time it slept. But when the loggers came and the farmers and brought their own griefs, it started to wake. It grew hungry." She pointed a bony finger toward the northeast. "They called it the place where colors go to die. They stayed away. We forgot to." A profound silence followed her words. It was a story. It was the truth. Sam knew what he had to do. Eris's science could maybe damage the phenomenon, but it couldn't heal the wound. The stone remembered pain. To quiet it, you had to offer it something it couldn't metabolize. Not another drop of sorrow. You had to offer it a memory so vibrant, so full of messy, loud, living love, that it would choke on it. He looked at Eris, at the fierce, logical woman fighting an illogical terror. He looked at the scared faces of his neighbors. He thought of Elise, not her gray hospital bed end, but her life, her stupid, loud laugh, the way she argued about books, the furious, colorful passion with which she lived. "I'm going back," Sam said, his voice carrying in the quiet hall. "To the heart." Eris stared at him. "You'll die. Or worse." Maybe, he said, but I'm not going to fight it, and I'm not going to feed it my grief. Then what will you do? Sam touched the photo over his heart. I'm going to tell it a story. Episode 5, The Color of a Memory. They went at dawn, but this time Sam went alone. Eris's role was to be the anchor, the tether to the world of noise and color. She would stay at the last functional sensor array, 200 yards from the stone circle, monitoring his biometrics. A futile gesture, but a necessary ritual. She had rigged a crude communication system, a single hardened earpiece for him and a microphone for her. The signal would likely die in the heart of the graying, but they had to try. You have 20 minutes once you enter the inner circle, Eris said, her voice tight. Her hand gripped his arm. Your vitals will drop, your brain activity will shift. After that, I don't know if you'll be able to come back.
Sam nodded.
He wore no bright orange now, just simple clothes. He carried no tools, only Billy Corrigan's notebook and the small photo in his pocket. His knife was left behind. This wasn't a battle of blades. The journey in was a descent into a forgotten photograph. The weeping was worse. Silvery rivulets traced the gray bark of trees, collecting in pools that reflected a sky that seemed lower, heavier. The air was so thick it was a tangible fluid, tasting of metal and salt. Every step was a battle against the crushing weight of nothingness. The whisper was back, but it had changed. It was no longer seductive. It was demanding. Give. It is all you have. Give the pain. Sam focused on his breathing, on the static crackle in his earpiece. A tiny, defiant spark of noise in the silent world. He reached the basin, the ring of bone-white hemlocks. The great stone pulsed its rhythm of anti-light, a heart beating in reverse, sucking life in with every dim. He crossed the threshold of the circle. The world vanished. Sound ceased utterly. Not even the memory of sound remained. The pressure was immense, a physical weight on his soul. He looked down at his hands. The color was leaching from his skin, crawling up from his fingertips like a slow, gray tide. He felt a coldness seep into his bones, a profound fatigue that promised eternal rest. Eris's voice sputtered in his ear, distorted and slow. Essum v vitals, they're dropping. He ignored it. He walked to the center of the clearing, standing before the sorrow stone. Up close, its surface was not smooth. It was a mosaic of frozen moments. A child's tear, a slumped shoulder, a silent scream, all rendered in infinite shades of gray. It was a museum of misery. You are pain, the presence pressed into his mind. You are made of it. We are the same. Join. Be still.
Sam's knees buckled.
The photo in his pocket felt like a block of ice. He wanted to give in, to let his memories of Elise turn gray and quiet and painless. It would be so easy. Then he thought of her voice. Not the last, weak whisper in the hospital, but her voice yelling with joy as they raced into the ocean on their honeymoon. A loud, brash, glorious noise. No, he said. The word made no sound in the void, but he formed it with his lips, with his will. He sank to his knees, not in submission, but to steady himself. He pulled the photo from his pocket. It was already fading, the edges turning gray. He didn't look at it. He closed his eyes, his gray-ringed, fading eyes, and he did not think of the end. He thought of the beginning. He pushed past the wall of his grief and reached for the specific, the vibrant, the noisy. The memory of the crash, the hospital, the silence. He deliberately turned his back on it. He reached further back. He remembered the color of her anger. Not a gray simmer, but a brilliant, flash-fire crimson when she'd found out he'd forgotten their anniversary. The way she'd slammed cabinet doors. The vivid, poetic torrent of her annoyance. He held that red in his mind, a defiant stain against the gray, a memory of discord. It feeds us, the stone pressed, but there was a tremor. He remembered the sound of her laugh. Not a gentle tinkle, but a full-throated, unladylike honk that would burst out at inappropriate times in quiet restaurants. He recreated the cadence of it in his mind, a chaotic, joyful percussion against the eternal silence. The gray tide on his fingers halted. The pressure lessened, just a fraction. He remembered the feel of her hair in the sun. Not the auburn color, but the warmth of it. The specific texture, the smell of her shampoo mixed with sea air. A sensory memory, tactile and olfactory, full of life. He opened his eyes. He held the fading photo up toward the stone. He didn't speak of loss. He spoke, pouring every ounce of will into the silent communication of her. She hated olives. She sang off-key in the shower. She believed in ghosts and thought calculus was a form of magic. She cried at dog food commercials and could argue politics until 3 a.m. She was not quiet. She was not still. She was a riot of color and sound and feeling. And you can't have her. He projected not the sorrow of her absence, but the glorious, messy, unbearable loudness of her presence. The memory of a life fully lived, not the shadow of its end. The stone pulsed erratically. The smooth gray surface rippled. The frozen images of sorrow within it seemed to swirl, disturbed. The mercurial tears leaking from its base flowed faster. Loud. The thought was a shard of pain in Sam's mind. Too loud. Yes, Sam thought, pushing harder, pouring every vibrant, chaotic, loving memory into the stone's receptive silence. The memory of their first fight, their first I love you. The time she painted the kitchen a horrible shade of yellow on a whim. Noise, color, chaos, life. The gray receded from his hands. The ring of hemlocks groaned, a sound like grinding bones. The stone's pulsations became frantic, stuttering. Eris's voice screamed in his ear, a distant, beautiful racket. Sam, the readings. It's fluctuating. The field is unstable. The sorrow stone was trying to process a memory it couldn't digest. It was built for grief, for the slow, quiet ache. Not for this torrent of vivid, loving detail. It was like trying to store a symphony in a library of sighs. A fissure, hair-thin and dark, appeared on the stone's surface. Then another. The emptiness around Sam began to hurt. It was a psychic recoil, a scream of wrongness. The pressure turned agonizing, not inviting, but expulsive. Stop. Sam didn't stop. He gave it everything, the final, brightest memory. Elise on a beach, spinning in a sundress of ridiculous blue, laughing at nothing, the sun turning her into a creature of pure, golden light. He offered the stone that sun, that blue, that laugh, with a silent, psychic detonation that Sam felt in the roots of his teeth. The stone repelled him. He was thrown backward, out of the circle, skidding across the gray dust. The world rushed back in. Not full color and sound, but a shuddering, painful return of sensation. The forest groaned and creaked around him. The gray was still there, but it was confused, blotchy. The monochrome was no longer absolute. Gasping, he looked at the stone. The fissures were spreading, webbing its surface. From them, not silvery tears, but a faint golden light seeped out. The light of a forgotten sun, the color of a remembered laugh. He scrambled to his feet and ran, stumbling, retching, back toward the world. The gray had not vanished, but its heart was cracked. And Sam Lennox, marked by its touch but armed with a color it could not comprehend, had brought the first seed of noise into the heart of the quiet. He burst from the tree line, collapsing into Eris's arms. The streak in his hair was now stark white, but the gray rings in his eyes had receded, just a little. Behind him, in the depths of the woods, a sound echoed. Not a bird, not the wind. A deep, resonant crack, like the world breaking a fever. The graying was wounded, but a wounded animal, especially one made of remembered sorrow, is often the most dangerous kind. The fight was not over. It had just changed shape. Episode 6. The Fracture. The crack in the sorrow stone did not heal. It grew, not with the speed of a lightning strike, but with the slow, terrible inevitability of a thawing glacier. The sound of it, a deep, subaudible groaning that vibrated in the fillings of your teeth, became a constant, unsettling bass note under the daily life of Harlow. The physical expansion of the graying halted. Eris's sensors confirmed it. The tenebrous border had stopped its advance at the very edge of the old quarry. But the stillness was no longer a passive blanket. It had become agitated. Inside the zone, the weeping intensified. The silvery, mercurial fluid no longer just seeped. It flowed in rivulets, gathering into shallow, reflective pools that seemed to swallow the feeble gray light. The trees in the intermediate zones began to exhibit a new, horrifying behavior. Tamenhui Wanchir, not from wind, but in slow, creaking arcs, as if drawn toward the fractured stone at the center, their gray branches reaching like pleading arms. The few remaining creatures caught within didn't just fade. They were often found twisted, their bodies contorted into poses of ancient anguish, frozen in the metallic residue. Sam was changed. The violent expulsion from the stone circle had left him with a permanent, low-grade tinnitus, a high-pitched whine that was the auditory ghost of the absolute silence he had breached. The white streak in his hair was now a broad, snowy bolt, but the gray rings in his irises had receded, replaced by a strange, faint golden starburst around the pupils, as if a tiny sun had gone supernova behind his eyes. He could still feel the town's subdued sorrows, but now they were jagged, spiked with a new flavor, a sharp, metallic anxiety emanating from the woods themselves. Eris, fighting her own creeping dread, a new streak of white now mirrored Sam's on her opposite temple, became obsessed with the fracture. Her data was chaotic, but one pattern emerged. The stone wasn't just leaking stored sorrow, it was venting it. The psychic capacitor was damaged, discharging its collected misery back into the environment in unpredictable waves. They called these events still storms. The first one hit 3 days after Sam's return. It wasn't a weather event. The sky remained clear. It was a sudden, localized plunge in emotional and sensory fidelity. In a 3-block radius downtown, colors washed out to sepia for 20 minutes. Conversations faltered as a profound, listless apathy gripped everyone. An old man on a park bench simply stopped blinking for the duration, his face slack. Mrs. Henderson, who ran the flower shop, looked at her vibrant bouquets and began to weep silvery tears that evaporated within seconds. Then, as suddenly as it came, it passed, leaving behind a collective headache and a deep, unshakable unease. The town was trapped. They couldn't leave. The state, getting wind of the ongoing fungal hazard, had established a soft containment perimeter. No one in or out without quarantine. And they couldn't stay, not with the land itself turning against them in fits of psychic malaise. Sheriff Morgan, his beard now fully the color of iron filings, came to Sam's cabin. "It's asking for you, Lennox," he said, his voice hoarse. He didn't need to specify what it was. "Old Elsie's been babbling. Says the stone is calling its reckoning. Says you woke it up proper, and now it needs to settle the account." "What account?" Eris asked, frowning. "The pain," Sam answered quietly, staring at his hands. "I didn't feed it my grief. I gave it indigestion. Now it wants to balance the books. It's going to take its payment directly. The second still storm was worse. It centered on the elementary school during recess. For 5 minutes, the laughter of children turned thin and distant, then silent. The bright primary colors of their jackets and balls faded to gray. Every child on the playground simultaneously experienced a crushing, age-inappropriate despair. The memory of a lost pet, the sting of a parent's sharp word, the existential dread of a failed test, all amplified and merged into a wave of gray sorrow. Teachers found them huddled, weeping gray tears, unable to articulate what was wrong. The effect lingered for hours in some, leaving them withdrawn and pale. Panic was no longer a threat. It was the ecosystem. The town council, in a desperate move, agreed to let ARIS try a physical intervention. A National Guard engineering unit, briefed on a geothermal toxic emission cover story, was brought in to drill a relief borehole near the stone, hoping to vent whatever energy was causing the phenomenon. It was a catastrophe. The moment the drill bit penetrated the unusual rock strata 100 yards from the stone circle, the graying didn't just react, it retaliated. A still storm of unprecedented violence erupted, centered on the drilling site. The sound of the machinery didn't fade. It was sucked into the ground. The engineers were hit with a concentrated blast of distilled apathy and historical sorrow. 2 dropped their tools and walked silently into the gray woods, never to be seen again. The others were found catatonic, their equipment coated in a rapidly hardening shell of silvery gray mineral. The drill rig itself was later found, its steel twisted into a smooth, cool, artistically despairing spiral, like a frozen scream in metal. And the fracture in the sorrow stone widened, with a sound heard across the entire town. A deep, tearing crunch. A shard the size of a car broke loose from its face. The shard did not fall. It hovered, levitating 6 feet above the gray earth, rotating slowly. And it began to move. Not quickly, at the pace of a slow walk. It drifted out of the stone circle, through the bone-white hemlocks, following no path, carving its own. Where it passed, the gray deepened instantly. The whispering apathy became a commanding drone. It was heading, with dreadful purpose, toward Harlow. The stone was not just wounded. It had sent out a probe, a seeker, collector, and Sam, watching the drone footage from ARIS's monitor, knew with cold certainty what, or who, it was seeking. The account it wanted to settle was personal. The shard was coming for the source of the loud, colorful memory that had broken its peace. It was coming for him. Episode 7. The Drift. The drifting shard of the Sorrow Stone moved with the patience of a glacier and the menace of a shark. It floated 5 feet above the ground, a jagged, house-sized piece of polished gloom, rotating slowly on an unseen axis. It didn't crush trees. It absorbed them. As it passed, the already grayed pines and spruces would blur, their forms softening and flowing like wet clay into the shard's base, adding to its mass in silent, horrifying increments. It was growing. It moved in a straight, unwavering line toward the town, following a psychic ley line of accumulated sorrow that Sam, with his new sensitivity, could now feel like a cold current in the earth. Its path would take it directly through the old cemetery on the outskirts of Harlow, then into the residential streets. Harlow descended into a state of siege psychosis. The National Guard, spooked by the equipment malfunction and the disappearances, tightened the perimeter but refused to enter the gray zone. They were a fence, not a shield. Inside, the town fractured. Some, led by the preacher, saw the drift, as it was instantly named, as a divine scourge and advocated for a sacrificial offering, a notion that made Sam's blood run cold. Others barricaded themselves in basements, The sheriff and a handful of volunteers formed a desperate watch, tracking the shard's slow progress with drones and binoculars. Sam knew they couldn't stop it with drills or bullets. You couldn't fight an idea made stone. But you could, perhaps, confuse it, redirect it. It's following a trail, he told Eris and a grim-faced Sheriff Morgan in the cabin. The map was spread out, the shard's path marked in red. A trail of pain. My pain is the loudest to it. It's fresh and it's tied to the memory that hurt it. But it's also feeding on the old, buried sorrows of this place. The cemetery, the old poor farm site, the spot where the mill burned down in 42. They're like breadcrumbs. So we move the breadcrumbs? Morgan asked, skepticism warring with desperation. We create a louder trail, Eris said, catching Sam's thought. Her scientific mind was adapting to the surreal logic of their enemy. A competing emotional signal. Not sorrow. Something else. Joy? The sheriff scoffed. A block party? Too diffuse, Sam said. His mind, the writer's mind now fully awake and burning with a terrible clarity, worked the problem. It needs to be focused, potent, and it has to be real. You can't fake this thing out with forced happiness. It feeds on authenticity. He looked at Eris, at the new silver in her hair, at the determined fear in her eyes. It has to be a memory or a moment of such powerful, specific emotion that it drowns out the signal of sorrow. Even for a little while. The plan was born of madness, but it was the only one they had. They would stage an intervention not on the shard, but on the town. They would create a moment of such collective, resonant emotion that it would flare like a beacon on the psychic landscape, potentially drawing the drift off its course, or at least slowing it, confusing it. They chose the town hall, and they chose a story. Old Elsie Murch, her voice trembling but clear, stood before the gathered, terrified citizens. She did not speak of monsters or God's wrath. At Sam's gentle prompting, she began to tell the old stories. Not the ghost stories, but the love stories. The tale of Jedediah Harlow, the town's founder, who carved his wife's name into every beam of the first house he built, a house that still stood. She told of the winter of the blue snow, when families shared their last potatoes and sang hymns together to keep their spirits up, and no one died. She spoke of small, forgotten heroisms and stubborn, everyday love. Then others were coaxed up. A farmer, his voice rough, spoke of his father teaching him to plow a straight line, the pride in the old man's eyes. A young woman, face streaked with recent gray tears, haltingly recounted how the town had fundraised for her sister's cancer treatment. It was awkward, painful, vulnerable. It was real. Sam watched from the back, feeling the emotional temperature in the room shift. The dense fog of fear didn't lift, but it was pierced by these sharp, bright shafts of memory. Achingly human, defiantly alive. He focused, trying to project these feelings, to weave them into a psychic rope, a lasso of lived experience to throw at the advancing stone. Outside, the drift entered the old cemetery. Paused. Above the gray, weathered headstones, the shard's slow rotation halted. It hung, silent and immense, over the buried grief of generations. It should have feasted, but the signal from the town hall, a ragged, messy chorus of loves and loyalties and regrets that were not passive, but fiercely remembered, washed over it. The shard vibrated, emitting a low hum that shook tombstones and caused the few crows still in the area to fall from the sky, stunned. It changed direction. Not much. A bare 5 degrees to the north. But it was enough. Instead of plowing through the densest part of town, its new path would take it through the abandoned textile mill on the river's edge, a place of its own sorrow, but a contained one. They had bought time and a slightly better battleground. But as the meeting broke up, a haggard heiress checked her monitors. "The main stone," she whispered to Sam. "The fracture is spreading. And the bio readings from within the zone. Sam, there's movement. Not the shard. Something else. Smaller. Multiple." The shard was not the only piece that had broken loose. Episode 8. The Echoes. The Sorrow Stone wasn't just shedding a massive shard. It was fragmenting. As the central fracture web cracked further, smaller pieces, ranging from the size of a fist to that of a refrigerator, detached and began to drift through the graying. These fragments didn't follow the deliberate path of the large drift. They moved erratically, like predatory fish in a gray sea, lingering in places of concentrated emotional residue. Eris dubbed them echoes. An echo, they soon learned, was a focused manifestation of a specific sorrow. The stone psychic capacitor wasn't just leaking. It was projecting encapsulated memories of pain. The first encounter was with a refrigerator-sized echo that settled in the shell of the Carson house, where Jenny still lay in her catatonic state. Her husband, desperate, had refused to evacuate. The echo, smooth and cold, settled in her bedroom doorway. That night, the entire neighborhood heard it. Not a sound, but the impression of sound. A child's bewildered sobbing, the frantic scratching of a lost dog at a door, and underneath it, Jenny Carson's own silent, years-old grief over a miscarriage she'd never spoken of. The echo was broadcasting the house's hidden heartache, amplifying it until the walls themselves seemed to weep silvery residue. Mr. Carson was found the next morning, his hair gone fully white, sitting silently beside his wife, holding her gray-tinged hand, a look of serene, awful understanding on his face. Another echo, a jagged piece like a stalagmite, drifted to the playground where the still storm had hit. It hovered above the swings, and children for blocks around had nightmares of falling, of being forgotten, of disappointing their parents in sharp, visceral detail they'd never consciously known. The town was being haunted by its own past pains, given form and agency. The gray was no longer just an environment. It was an active predator, hunting with personalized bait. Meanwhile, the large drift had reached the riverfront mill. It stopped at the water's edge. The Kennebec River, normally a powerful, muddy brown flow, turned sluggish and pale where it neared the gray zone, as if the very water was losing its will to run to the sea. The drift began to absorb the massive brick structure, not with violence, but with a terrible, slow integration. The red bricks turned gray, lost their mortar, and flowed like liquid sand into the shard's mass. Within a day, half the mill was gone, and the drift had grown larger, its surface now faintly textured with the ghostly impressions of brickwork and rusted machinery. Sam, Eris, and Sheriff Morgan knew the mill was just a pause. The drift would soon resume its path toward the heart of town, and toward Sam. They had to act while it was relatively stationary. Eris's theory was that the echoes were the key. They're extensions of the main consciousness but semi-autonomous. Like nerve endings. If we can disrupt them, cause feedback in the system, it might destabilize the drift, maybe even the main stone. How? Morgan growled. We can't get near them. That Carson echo. It doesn't attack, it just is. And it makes you want to lie down and die. Sam was staring at Billy Corrigan's notebook, open to the words, "It remembers." He thought of what he'd done at the stone. He hadn't fought the memory. He had replaced it with a better one. We don't disrupt them, Sam said, a dangerous idea forming. We reprogram them. He proposed targeting the smallest, most isolated echo they could find. A basketball-sized fragment that had come to rest in the overgrown garden of the town's long-closed orphanage, a place rife with old, lonely sorrow. Their tool would not be a drill but a story, a specific, true story tied to that place. With Elsie Murch's help, they dug through archives and found one. In 1931, a young boy named Peter, slated for transfer to a harsher institution, had hidden in the garden. The townsfolk, in a quiet act of defiance, had pretended not to see him, bringing him food until a local farmer, a childless widower, finally agreed to take him in. Peter had grown up to be a beloved mechanic in town. He had died loved just 10 years ago. It was a story of sorrow averted, of quiet community compassion, a small, bright stitch in a tapestry of gray. Sam, Eris, and Morgan approached the orphanage garden. The echo hung there, a smooth, gray orb, pulsing faintly. The air was thick with the psychic residue of abandonment, a hollow, cold feeling that settled in the chest. Sam held a photograph of old Peter, smiling beside a car he'd restored. He didn't try to project joy. He focused on the specificity of the story, the taste of the stew Mrs. Gable had brought, the smell of the damp earth in the garden hideout, the gruff, kind voice of the farmer saying, "Well, boy, I suppose you'd better come home then." He poured the memory, rich in sensory detail and quiet emotion, directly at the echo. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the gray surface of the echo rippled. The pulsing light within it stuttered, flickering between its dull gray and a faint, momentary amber. A sound, like a distant sigh, whispered through the garden. The crushing feeling of abandonment lifted, just for a few seconds, replaced by a fleeting sense of safety. The echo didn't shatter. It didn't turn bright, but it drifted. It moved slowly, aimlessly, away from the orphanage, toward the river, as if confused. Its connection to the network of sorrow momentarily scrambled. It had worked. Not a cure, but an intervention. As they left, exhausted but hopeful, Eris's radio crackled. A watchman at the mill reported movement. The drift was finished with the mill. It had absorbed the last of the bricks, and it was turning, not toward the town center. It was turning toward the orphanage, toward them. The Sorrowstone's probe had felt the interference. It was coming to investigate the source of the anomalous, non-sorrowful signal. It was coming for the storyteller. Episode 9, The Beckoning. The drift moved with a new, disturbing purpose. It no longer followed the meandering psychic rivers of old grief. It carved a direct, unwavering path through the gray zone toward the orphanage, accelerating to the speed of a walking man. The ground beneath it didn't just bleach. It sank, compressed by its immense, concentrated stillness, leaving a smooth, glassy trench in its wake. Sam, Eris, and the sheriff barely had time to flee before the colossal shard loomed over the garden wall. It didn't pause to absorb the orphanage. It simply passed through it. The old wooden structure didn't collapse. It unmade. Boards grayed, lost their grain, and dissolved into fine, silent dust that rose and was absorbed into the shard's swirling base. In less than a minute, a building that had stood for a century was a memory, and the drift was larger, its surface now ghosted with the faint, screaming faces from faded wallpaper. It stopped in the center of the now empty lot, rotating slowly. It was searching. Sam, watching from a hilltop a quarter-mile away through binoculars, felt it. A cold, pinpoint focus, like the beam of a lighthouse in a frozen sea, sweeping the landscape. And when it passed over him, it locked. A psychic hook, cold and sharp, set deep in his soul. He gasped, dropping the binoculars. The high-pitched whine in his ears escalated to a deafening shriek, and behind it, he heard the voice, clearer than ever before. "You are the discord, the noise in the silence. You are the unsettled debt. Come, settle." It wasn't an invitation. It was a summons, and it carried with it a promise. If he came, it would leave the town. It would take its hunger and go dormant once more. its appetite focused solely on consuming the brilliant, painful, colorful memory of Elise that had wounded it. It wanted to digest him and through him, her. "It's offering a deal," Sam whispered, his face ashen. "No deal," Sheriff Morgan snapped. "It's a trick. You go out there, you become like Billy Corrigan. Or worse." Eris, analyzing data from seismic sensors they'd placed, looked grim. "It's not a trick. It's a transaction. The stone is a system. You introduced a corrupting element, a vibrant, loving memory into a bank of sorrow. It's causing a systemic error. The fragmentation, the echoes, the drift. It's all a destabilization. It wants to quarantine the corruption, to isolate and absorb you to return to equilibrium. So if I go, it might stop? The gray might recede. Or it might absorb you and become stronger, having integrated a new, more complex form of pain," Eris said. "There's no way to know." The drift began moving again, not toward Sam's hill, but on a new, calculated path. It was heading for the clinic, where the catatonic victims, Jenny Carson, the National Guard engineers, others, were housed. A warehouse of sorrow, ripe for harvest. It was upping the ante, showing its leverage. That night, Sam dreamed not of Elise, but of the stone. He stood before the fractured monolith. This time, it showed him not frozen sorrows, but a vision. Harlow, not gray and dead, but normal. Children playing. Colors bright. The gray a distant, shrinking bruise on the horizon. The price was him. He would stand forever within the stone, a vibrant, humming kernel of love and loss, forever being dissolved, feeding the quiet, keeping it sated and still. Eternal battery of beautiful pain. He woke, not in a sweat, but cold, resolved. He went to Eris's makeshift lab. "We're not going to fight it, and I'm not just going to surrender. We're going to negotiate." "How?" "You said it's a system. I'm a corrupt file. We need to reformat me before I hand myself over." Eris stared, comprehension dawning. "You want to change your own emotional signature. I can't stop loving Elise. I won't. That's the core of the corruption. But maybe I can wrap it in something else. Something the stone can't process at all." He looked at her, his gold-streaked eyes intense. "You're a scientist. You believe in data, in truth. That's your core. What if I anchor my memory of her not just in my love, but in truth? Not just the beautiful noise, but the whole complicated, sometimes ugly, real story of us. The lies we told, the compromises, the petty annoyances, the unconditional love that lived underneath it all. Not a perfect memory, a true one. Maybe that's a file format it can't open." It was a desperate, metaphysical gamble, to voluntarily revisit and reshape his most sacred memories, not to diminish them, but to make them realer, denser, more complex than simple sorrow. For the next 24 hours, as the drift ominously paused just yards from the clinic, Sam worked with Eris. It was a brutal form of therapy. He talked. He recounted arguments, jealousies, his own failings, her secret fears. He painted a picture of a marriage, not a romance. A living, breathing, flawed thing. Eris recorded it all, not with judgment, but with the reverence of an archaeologist uncovering a city. She helped him focus, to imbue these true, difficult memories with the same sensory weight he'd given the happy ones. He was not erasing the beautiful noise. He was building a cathedral of truth around it, with room for shadows. As he worked, the white streak in his hair seemed to glow, and the golden starbursts in his eyes grew more distinct. He was changing himself from the inside out. The drift, sensing the shift in its target, grew agitated. It began to emit a low-frequency vibration that shattered windows in the clinic. The catatonic patients inside all stirred simultaneously, turning their heads toward the walls, silvery tears flowing in unison. The stone was done waiting. It was time to collect. Episode 10, The Offering. Sam stood at the newly established front line, a makeshift barricade of trucks and sawhorses 2 blocks from the clinic. Beyond it, the world was a study in monochrome. The drift filled the street, a mountain of polished gloom that absorbed the afternoon light, casting a long, void-like shadow that seemed to suck the warmth from the pavement. It had stopped its vibration. An awful, anticipatory silence emanated from it, thicker than any before. The town watched, hidden behind doors and windows. Sheriff Morgan stood beside Sam, his hand resting on his sidearm, a useless gesture. Eris was nearby, a backpack of instruments at her feet, her face a mask of professional dread. "You don't have to do this, Sam," Morgan said, for the 100th time.
Yes, Ido, Sam replied.
His voice was calm. He felt a strange clarity. He was not the broken man who had come to Harlow to hide. He was not just a vessel of grief. He was a story, and he was about to tell the ending. He had said no goodbyes. He simply nodded to Eris, a look passing between them that contained a universe of thanks and understanding. Then he stepped around the barricade and walked into the gray. The effect was immediate and violent. The world didn't just fade. It inverted. Sound didn't dampen. It was ripped away, leaving a vacuum that pressed on his eardrums. Color didn't wash out. It was forcibly extracted, leaching from his clothes, his skin, bleeding into the air like smoke drawn toward the shard. The psychic hook in his soul pulled taut, dragging him forward. The voice was a deafening silence that structured his thoughts. Come. Settle. Be still. Each step was agony, not of pain, but of existential erosion. He felt his memories being skimmed, tasted. The happy ones, the loud ones, were met with a psychic flinch, a recoil of disgust. The stone wanted the core of it, the pure, unadulterated loss. He reached the foot of the drift. It loomed over him, a cliff face of frozen despair. Up close, he could see the captured impressions. The brickwork of the mill, the screaming faces from the orphanage wallpaper, the twisted form of a National Guard helmet. It was a museum of Harlow's ingested sorrow. He looked up and did not plead. He did not project his beautiful, curated memories. He opened himself utterly and completely and offered the truth. He thought of the night he forgot their anniversary. Not just her anger, the flashfire crimson, but his own petty defensiveness, the way he'd sulked, the stupid, prideful silence that had stretched for hours. He remembered the exact taste of the cheap whiskey he'd drunk alone, the gritty feeling of shame in his throat. He thought of her fear of elevators, a silly, secret thing she'd trusted him with, not as a charming quirk, but as a real, sweat-beaded panic he'd sometimes been impatient with. He thought of his jealousy over her successful colleague, the small, cold lie he'd told to make her stay home one night, the way she'd looked at him, knowing, but choosing not to call him on it. He offered every flaw, every failure, every unkind moment, his and hers. He wrapped them around the core of his love, not as a shield, but as proof. Proof that the love was real. It existed in the messy, noisy, difficult world of choices and mistakes. It was not a pristine memory for a quiet tomb. It was a lived experience. He projected it all not as a beam of light, but as a dense, tangled, real thing. A knot of human experience. The drift shuddered. The smooth gray surface rippled like water. The captured images within swirled chaotically. The brickwork blurred. The screaming faces contorted in confusion. The stone was trying to process, to file this offering, and it couldn't. It wasn't sorrow. It wasn't joy. It was complexity. It was life, in all its contradictory, unquiet glory. What is this? The voice was not commanding now. It was bewildered. It's us, Sam thought, pouring every ounce of his being into the communication. It's real. You can have my pain. You can have my grief. But you have to take all of it. The love and the lies. The joy and the jealousy. You can't have the quiet without the noise that made it. They're the same thing. A fissure, mirroring the one on the main stone, appeared on the face of the drift. Not a crack of damage, but a seam of uncertainty. A silvery tear, not of sorrow but of cognitive dissonance, welled from the fissure and dripped, sizzling onto the gray pavement. The psychic pull on Sam weakened. The draining of color from his body halted. He stood, a figure of muted hues against the perfect gray, holding his ground not with force, but with the unbearable weight of an honest story. Back at the barricade, Eris's instruments went wild. The field, it's oscillating. The coherence is breaking down. The drift began to tremble. Its perfect, geometric rotation stuttered. It was trying to reject the offering, but the hook was in it as much as in Sam. They were connected, and Sam was feeding it a truth it had no category for. With a sound like a universe sighing, the drift did not attack. It did not absorb him. It began to unmake itself. From the top down, the massive shard dissolved into a cloud of fine, luminous gray mist. The mist did not spread. It hung in the air, swirling, and then, as if following a reverse wind, it streamed away from the town, back toward the heart of the woods, back toward the fractured sorrow stone. It was retreating, taking the incomprehensible data with it. Sam watched it go, exhausted to the bone. The gray world around him remained, but the predatory intelligence was gone. Recalled. The street was just a dead place now. He turned and walked back toward the barricade. As he crossed out of the gray, color flooding back into his world with a painful, glorious intensity, he stumbled. Eris and the sheriff caught him. He looked at them, his eyes, the gold now a permanent, bright ring around his pupils, clear. "It's not over," he rasped. "It's confused. It's licking its wounds. It has my story now. It doesn't know what to do with it." He looked past them, toward the terrified, hopeful faces of the town peering out. And then he looked northeast, to where the gray still hung, a blot on the land. The quiet had been broken, not by a shout, but by a whisper of unbearable truth. The war was no longer for survival. It was for definition. What would the sorrow stone become, now that it had tasted something other than sorrow? Sam Lennox, marked by both the quiet and the noise, would have to find out. The final accounting was yet to come. Episode 11, The Reckoning. The retreat of the drift was not a victory. It was a strategic withdrawal. The gray zone did not recede. It stabilized, but in a new, ominous configuration. The agitated still storms ceased, and the smaller echoes drifting through town lost their predatory focus, becoming inert, gray boulders. A heavy, watchful silence fell over Harlow. Not the passive quiet of before, but the tense, breath-held stillness of a standoff. The sorrow stone was processing. Eris's sensors told a cryptic story. The anomalous energy readings from the epicenter had stopped their chaotic fluctuations. They now pulsed with a slow, deep, regular rhythm, lube-dub, like the heartbeat of a sleeping giant. The fracture lines on the main stone, visible from enhanced drone imagery, had stopped spreading. They now glowed with a faint internal light, not the sickly silver of the weeping, but a dim, ambiguous gold gray, like sunlight seen through thick, dirty ice. Sam was the nexus. The change in him was permanent and profound. The white streak in his hair was a brilliant shock against the brown. The golden starbursts in his irises gave him an unsettling, piercing gaze, and his sensitivity had evolved. He no longer just felt the town's sorrow. He could feel the stone's consciousness, a vast, slow, grinding thing at the edge of his perception. It wasn't thinking in words, but in landscapes of emotion. And right now, those landscapes were confused. The pristine, gray deserts of absorbed sorrow were now marred by a single, stubborn, technicolor splatter. His memory, the complex truth of Elise and their life together. The stone couldn't assimilate it, couldn't expel it. The memory sat in its psyche like a grain of sand in an oyster, an irritant of dazzling, painful beauty. It's in a state of cognitive dissonance on a geological scale, Eris murmured, staring at her screens in Sam's cabin. Its entire function is to simplify, to reduce vibrant pain to quiet, gray stillness. You gave it something that refuses to be reduced. So what happens now? Sheriff Morgan asked. The immediate threat was gone, but the tension was worse. The unknown was a sharper knife. It either finds a way to digest him, Eris said, nodding at Sam, or it has to change its diet, adapt, evolve. Sam spoke from the window, looking toward the woods. It's calling me, not to consume me, to negotiate. For real this time. The last time was a trap. This is different. It needs resolution. The call was not a voice, but a pull deeper than the previous hooks. It was a gravitational tug from his very core. The golden streaks in his eyes throbbed in time with the distant, stone heartbeat. He knew if he didn't answer, the stalemate would hold until the stone, in its immense, slow patience, found a new solution. One that might involve purging the irritant by lashing out at its source, the whole town. The final accounting was due, and Sam was the ledger. He made his decision. He would go to the heart, alone, but not as a sacrifice, as an ambassador of messy, complicated life. There was no dramatic farewell. He packed a small bag, water, a little food, Billy Corgan's notebook, and the now faded photo. He wore sturdy clothes. Eris, her scientific mind finally accepting the necessity of the symbolic, gave him no instruments. Instead, she gave him a small, smooth stone from the vibrant, living creek behind the cabin. A counterweight, she said, a piece of the noisy world. Sheriff Morgan handed him a flare gun. Not for that, he said, jerking his head toward the woods. For us, if you need us to know something. Any sign. Sam nodded, pocketing it. He looked at them both, the logical woman who had learned to believe in ghosts, the pragmatic sheriff who had learned to fight shadows. They were his tether, his noise. He walked into the graying for the last time. The journey was different. The crushing apathy was gone. The silence was no longer hungry. It was attentive. The gray trees seemed to lean in, observing. The weeping had stopped. The pools of metallic sorrow had hardened into smooth, mirror-like surfaces that reflected his walking form. But in those reflections, his golden eyes shone with impossible light. The path to the stone circle was clear, as if the forest itself was guiding him. He reached the basin. The ring of bone-white hemlocks stood sentinel. In the center, the sorrow stone awaited. It was transformed. The great fracture was now a vivid, branching scar of that same gold-gray light, pulsing softly. The surface around it was no longer uniformly polished. Patches showed faint, ghostly textures, the hint of brick, the echo of a smile, the blur of a moving car, fragments of the memories it had absorbed from Sam and the town, refusing to be fully silenced. It was no longer a monument to pure sorrow. It was a monument to memory itself, in all its agony and ecstasy. Sam walked into the circle. The absolute silence descended, but it held no menace now. It was a chamber, awaiting his testimony. He stood before the stone and did not kneel. He placed the creek stone from Eris on the ground before him, a tiny island of alien, ungray reality. Then he opened himself. He did not project a single story. He offered a continuum. He showed the stone the chain of being. His petty jealousy linked to his fierce protectiveness. Her flashfire anger linked to her bottomless compassion. The crash that killed her was linked to the picnic where they'd laughed so hard they cried the week before. He showed that sorrow was not the opposite of joy, it was its echo, that love was the gravity that held both in orbit. He showed it Harlow, not just its tragedies, but its resilience. Billy Corrigan's simple joy in a bottle. The shared stew in the winter of blue snow. The community saving a boy from the orphanage. He poured into the stone the unbearable, beautiful end of existence. Pain and healing, loss and memory, silence and the echo that proves sound existed. The stone absorbed it. The golden light in its fissure flared, brightening. The pulse of its heartbeat quickened. The ghostly impressions on its surface swirled, coalescing, trying to form a new pattern. And then the stone spoke back. Not in words, but in a direct download of feeling. It showed Sam its own birth, not from a geological event, but from a cataclysm of forgotten grief. A native village wiped by plague, their final, collective despair so potent it had seeped into the bedrock, crystallizing into this psychic sump. For centuries, it had done its lonely work, drawing in small sorrows, keeping them still and quiet. It had no malice. It was a function, a organ of the land meant to process pain. Sam's offering was the first thing that had ever asked it to be more. The understanding flowed between them, a silent river. The stone's purpose was not wrong. Pain needed a place to go, but it didn't need to be the end. Could be part of a cycle. A proposal formed not in language but in a shared crystalline concept. The stone would not leave. Could not. It was part of the land. But it would change. It would no longer be a sump. It would become an archive. It would still accept sorrow, that was its nature, but it would no longer strip it to gray stillness. It would hold the memory of the pain in context, alongside the memory of what was lost, of what caused the love that made the loss hurt. It would become a library of lived experience, not a tomb for feeling. In return, it asked for a curator, a bridge, someone who understood both the noise and the quiet. The pull Sam felt settled into a choice, laid bare before him. The golden light from the stone's fissure reached out, not to consume him, but to offer. He could take his place here not as a battery, but as a librarian. His consciousness would merge with the stone's slow awareness. He would be the interpreter, the one who helped it file the new, complex memories. He would be Harlow's guardian, woven into the land itself, feeling its joys and sorrows forever, but from within the calm eye of the storm. He would be with Elise in a way, because his every memory of her would be the cornerstone of this new archive. The alternative was to walk away. The stone would still change, but more slowly, blindly. The gray might eventually recede, or it might one day, confused again, lash out. And Sam would return to the world of the living, marked, changed, carrying the stone's quiet within him always, a living scar. He looked at the small, colorful creek stone. He thought of Eris's fierce mind, of the sheriff's weary courage, of the sound of a child's laugh not yet tinged with grief. He thought of the noise. Then he thought of the deep, resonant peace that emanated from the stone's new proposal. An end to his loneliness, not in death, but in eternal, purposeful belonging. A reunion with Elise in the only way left. Sam Lennox made his choice. He reached out and placed his hand upon the cold, living surface of the Sorrow Stone. Episode 12. Epilogue: The Librarian's Peace. 5 years later, the path to the Harlow Memorial Glade was well tended but rarely crowded. It was a place people came to for specific reasons, not for picnics. The town had recovered, though recovery wasn't quite the right word. It had adapted. The gray zone had receded dramatically, shrinking to a quarter of its original size, centered on the stone basin. It was no longer called the graying. It was simply the glade. The forest around it had returned to life, but a different life. The trees were strong and healthy, but their greens were deeper, more somber. Birds sang, but their songs were clearer, sweeter, tinged with a melancholy that felt ancient and respectful. The air in the glade itself was always still and quiet, but it was a clean quiet like the hush in a great library. At the center stood the stone. It was no longer a monolith of gloom. The fracture was healed over with a vein of what looked like pure, polished amber, through which a soft, warm light gently pulsed. The stone's surface was no longer smooth. It was subtly textured, like the pages of 1,000 different books pressed together. Moss grew on its north face. Sometimes, if you placed your hand on it, you didn't feel cold stone, but a gentle vibration and a fleeting emotion. Not a specific memory, but a quality. A mother's patience, the sting of a first betrayal followed by the warmth of forgiveness, the ache of missing someone mixed with gratitude for having known them. Dr. Eris Thorne visited once a month. She had stayed in Harlow, her career with the USGS pivoting to the study of unique, psychically resonant geologies. She sat on the bench the town had placed at the edge of the stone circle, updating the stone on her life on the town, reading from scientific journals she thought he might find interesting. She never felt foolish. She felt heard. Her hair was now elegantly streaked with white, and she wore it with pride. Sheriff Ed Morgan, retired, came to talk about his grandkids, about the town council's latest petty drama. He'd leave feeling a little lighter, as if he'd confided in a wise, old friend who asked for nothing in return. And sometimes people with a fresh, raw grief would come. They wouldn't know why exactly. They'd just feel drawn. They'd sit and they'd cry, or they'd just be still. And they'd leave feeling not that their pain was gone, but that it had been acknowledged, filed away in a place where it was safe, and where it was part of a larger, beautiful pattern. The stone didn't take the pain away. It gave it a home. On this particular autumn afternoon, a young woman approached. She had auburn hair that caught the sun like fire. She held a simple, smooth stone from the creek in her hand, a tradition started by a story people told about the town's protector. She sat on the bench for a long time, watching the amber light in the stone pulse steadily. Finally, she spoke, her voice soft. "I'm getting married next spring," she said. "His name is Leo. He makes me laugh. He's nothing like you from what Mom says, but I think you'd like him." She swallowed, a glint of silver in her own eyes. Eyes that, if one looked closely, had the faintest, most beautiful golden starburst around the pupils. "I wish you could be there, Dad." The pulse in the stone's amber heart quickened, just for a moment. A warmth radiated from it, cutting the autumn chill. The young woman, Chloe Lennox, felt a wave of emotion. Not words, but a pure, complex stream.
Pride.
A love so vast it was dizzying. The faint, echoic sound of her mother's laugh. And beneath it all, a profound, unshakable peace. It was the feeling of a story, finally and perfectly understood. A story of love and loss, of noise and quiet, that hadn't ended in a period, but in a quiet, pulsing em-dash, connecting forever to the world it had left behind. Chloe smiled, a tear tracing a clean, non-silver path down her cheek. She placed the creek stone at the base of the sorrow stone, now the archive stone beside dozens of others. A new offering, a new, happy, noisy memory for the librarian to catalog. In the deep, quiet heart of the stone, in a stillness that was now full of echoes and colors and light, Sam Lennox felt his daughter's joy. He wove it into the eternal, living tapestry around him, a tapestry anchored by the brilliant, complicated, loving memory of a woman named Elise. He was not lonely. He was part of everything. The sorrows of Harlow flowed to him and were soothed. Its joys flowed to him and were celebrated. He was the quiet at the center of the storm. He was the memory that refused to fade. He was home, and in the great, silent library of the stone, all was perfectly, resonantly, at peace. The end.